Okay, this is kind of what we say in Swedish, a smörgåsbord of different perspectives and knowledge and information. And I thought that I knew a little bit about what's going on, but I didn't, I realize. So, are there any questions here from the audience? So if not, I would like, okay, there is one. Gustav.
Linda. Do you keep count of how many illegal sites or uncertified?
It's not on, I think.
So,
yeah.
Okay, my question is, do you keep count of how many illegal sites or uncertified online pharmacies who is operating in Sweden right now or is targeting a Swedish-speaking public?
Yes, we have quite good knowledge about it, and of course Interpol has a good knowledge about what sites there are popular, that is ongoing, and that is also one thing that we work against when we do those Pangea operations. But also you have Darknet, and Darknet is something else than those internet sites, and that is harder to have a full view into Darknet.
Okay. When you identify a site as illegal, which measurements do you have to put it down, or how do you act upon those sites?
We act more or less the way I showed you. Swedish laws don't have, the legislation doesn't give us the right to shut down a site, but that we can do through other countries, and that's like, for example, Europol. What's the problem is that a server needs to have its hub in Sweden to be able to be shut down by Swedish law enforcement, which not often happens. They do it on some proxy server or whatever, and then it's quite hard to trace them. But we have the power through Interpol to shut down if we want to.
Yeah, that was the answer.
Thanks.
Does someone in the panel want to comment on that? So I would like to ask you, Lina, again, regarding this, a little bit the same as you were asking about, the law. So the people, it was from 1 year to 10 years, yeah. The sentence. So 1 year is that's not a lot.
No.
So as I understand it, there is a rather, the law is not functioning, so to speak, in most countries when it comes to falsified medicine. Am I right?
No, as I told you, this case was a matter of course, it was a matter of falsified medicine, but that's not something we go to court with often. We go to court with the longest sentence, and that's usually the narcotic crimes that can give you 14 years, or doping crimes, and steroid crimes, and that can give you up to 6 years. So if you would look like it that way, the law enforcement can do the easy way and go for the more heavier crimes, which is a bad thing. Because of course you see a lot of falsified medicines that you should look into more.
But am I right that there is a new law coming up now when it comes in Sweden regarding falsified medicine?
I don't know that. I don't have any knowledge about it.
Okay.
Just comment on what Linda just said. The law enforcement aspect, the criminal justice system is very important. It's what I was speaking about earlier. It's ensuring that once you've dealt with the short-term requirements of dealing with falsified medicines, that it doesn't happen again. And indeed, in a lot of countries, the jurisdiction and the legislation is not in place. In many countries, sometimes it's easier to get a stronger sentence on trade laws rather than falsified medicine laws. So that's something that's very important, that countries who want to strengthen their capacity and build proper response against falsified medicines, they must also include this aspect. And when we go in countries and we train them to deal with that, we always try and insist heavily that it must be healthcare practitioners working with the Medicines Regulatory Agency, working with customs, police, and all the other law enforcement and legislative structures in the country.
Kjell, please.
This Operation Robin seems very impressive. But what's the magnitude of this, the long-term effects of such a huge operations? Is it just scratching on the surface, or is it a major blow to the whole industry?
Oh, it's hard to say. It's good to say that it's a major blow, because that would be good for our department, but it's hard to say. I think what's interesting in this case is now you actually have the opportunity to look at how many that actually are using in Scandinavia, because at this time we was quite sure that it was just this organization providing Scandinavia with steroid, most of it Sweden. So then you could see the magnitude of people actually using these kind of products. And that I think is quite rare, that you find this massive informations in just one case. But of course, it's not to pat us so much on the chest. Of course, this is continuing with someone else or in some other way.
The gentleman up there.
Thank you very much. Organized crime usually search for markets where the risk of detection is very low, and often combine that the sentences for the crime is as low as possible. Now, if you should have a deterrent effect, could you just elaborate a little bit on, this is obviously a very difficult market to detect compared to other crimes. And if you combine that with the relatively low sentences that could be the result of detecting this crime, do you think you have enough of deterrent aspects on the problem as of now?
I would say that, of course, you refer to people getting 1 year and stuff like that in this investigation, and the reason for why people getting quite low sentence when you come to a case like this is like it looks like a triangle. You want to charge the one that are in charge of everything the most, and the lower down you come, the lower the penalty would be. So if you would look at this in the back mirror and reflect over it, you could think, was it smart to go with everything, let the whole organization sit in one court, or should you have went with the leaders first and get 10 years on all of them, and then went down and charged them separately? Here they get lower because the vice director is sitting next to them, and they are in charge of everything, and all of the other ones below have a statute that is lower than the others, and they are acting on information from others. So generally, I would say that thanks in Sweden we got good resources to battle this, and we got good sentence to give out. I don't know if that was the answer on your question, or.
I think you answered correctly, but as a legislator, I'm interested in, should we look for increasing the sentences in general for this type of crime, have a new labeling of it, given the fact that it's not only narcotics. I mean, the narcotics that are falsified are not more dangerous than the falsified steroids, although there is a discrepancy between the maximum sentence, and that's to me is not correct, really.
Kerstin Hagenfeldt, I maybe missed it from the two first presentations. Can you hear me?
No.
Was there any way to find and take these imposters to jail or anything? I mean, I'm very happy to hear that the Swedish police system is so effective. But what happened to those people who did this with the vaccines or did this with the preparate in Congo? Has any of you any information on that?
But that's the big problem that we have in those countries. And as I was just saying before, without an efficient law enforcement and criminal law system, you'll never stop this traffic. We have cases where people have been arrested, but it's the minority of cases. In the case of the falsified vaccines in Niger, They arrested someone who had been importing the falsified vaccines. So there were two different types of falsified vaccines, and I didn't mention it because I had to go along a bit faster, but most of these were inoculated to children. NGOs who were vaccinating children, but you also had in the private sector, because in those endemic countries you have private companies who provide this type of healthcare protection to their employees and the families of their employees. So all these people were inoculated with a fake vaccine. And there was one person who was arrested, and the tribunal is still ongoing. But of course, the legislation in place is not very strong. And in other countries, there was another case in Pakistan. The person who was responsible for this, they fled the country. They left to another country because the death sentence was death. So they preferred to run away.
Okay, so we have several people now. Yes, please.
Yeah, I think there were
Okay. From the beginning, okay. I didn't pay attention. Good. Sorry, you have to wait. Okay, we take it that way.
I have two questions. The first one is for Lina, and the other one is for maybe two of you. So first of all is the darknet. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. For the darknet, we know it's all the emails, all the conversations are encrypted. And my question is, have you got any ideas why normal people or the really end users are buying or are willing to go to the darknet to buy those medicines?
I would just be guessing if I answer that. Actually, of course, people probably have their reasons to why they go in and order that way, and of course, it makes them more anonymous to make orders like that. But I don't have any knowledge, so I won't guess on it.
Okay. Yeah. And my other question is about the definition of falsified medicine, or SSFFC medicines. From the literature, we know that this is quite a bit messy with these definitions, and people from different areas of the world, they use different definitions. Do you have any comments on that, or which one do you suggest, both of you?
You go
Thanks.
Thank you. Indeed, it's a very difficult and contentious subject that's been rather disabling for the field, because people are often not talking about the same thing. I feel that we should use the term falsified for those that are fraudulently made, using from a public health perspective. And the counterfeit is a useful term, but that's really, after TRIPS, an intellectual property trademark term, which is unrelated to public health. So in our group, we use that, as we're a public health group, we use falsified for those from a public health perspective. We do use the term counterfeit, but only over trademark infringement. Let's see what the world decides over the next few months.
Yes, Paul's comment is very accurate. Counterfeit is indeed related to intellectual property rights issues, and like I explained, the WHO is not concerned with intellectual property rights issues. It's about, does the medicine contain what it's supposed to contain, and does it do what it's supposed to do? In the SSFFC acronym, the words spurious, falsified, and falsely labeled tend to be synonyms. And what is also important to stress is that WHO does not supersede national authority. Any given country can choose to call it whatever they want to call it, and we notice that in different regions of the world, people tend to call it differently. In South and Latin America, they tend to call it falsificado, which would be falsified. In Africa, they tend to call it counterfeit. In Asia, but not the Far East, Pakistan and India, they will call it spurious. But that's their own national law texts and legislation which call it that way, and it doesn't change anything in practice and in effect. And it is important nonetheless to have a common agreement on what we're talking about, whether we call it SSFC or falsified or spurious or whatever we call it. It's important that countries agree, and I believe that they're slowly coming to an agreement that SSFC or falsified medicines are definitely medicines that have not been manufactured by the manufacturer stated on the label and which do not contain what they are supposed to contain. But of course, it's important to test the products, because beyond the actual definitions issue, you will have falsified medicines which do contain some amount of active ingredient. We have an example of a falsified leukemia product, which tested okay on every single parameter except for dissolution. So if you use the strict definition of saying, does it contain the expected amount of API? Yes, in this one it contained the expected amount of API, but it was falsified beyond reasonable doubt because it was not manufactured by the company stated on the box. It was manufactured by a bogus company, and the dissolution was not right, so it had no effect. So countries are slowly coming to an agreement to have a common understanding, but it does not supersede national legislation. Does that answer your question?
Thank you. I think we had, yes, please.
I'm Barbara Westerholm on this committee, and it's a question for Lina Andersson. I might have missed it, but in your survey in Operation Robin, did you come across any sports organizations or sports clubs in this network, so to speak?
No.
Okay. Please.
Raffaele Ravinetto from Belgium. The question or the reflection is mainly for Paul, and I apologize because I arrived late for your presentation, so I may have missed something. I wanted to go to the other S in the acronym, in the substandard medicines, which, having quite a lot of experience as pharmacist and MSF when I was younger, it was the big nightmare for us, because with the falsified medicines, you know that it's a crime, while with the substandard, they have been approved by somebody, but by a series of unfortunate circumstances, they still are not good. And we have the tendency to think substandard, it means legal medicines where something went wrong, so we tend to think it was by mistake. So we tend to be a little bit indulgent to say there are the criminals and then there are the poor people who did mistakes. And in some cases, when with a given company, you keep on seeing the same mistake, especially for the batches which are going to sub-Saharan Africa, not the one which are going to Europe, you say, okay, it's not such an intention to fraud, but there is still something which would call intentional mistakes. So what we can do there, because then it goes back to the drug regulatory authority, it's such a big nightmare, so I just wanted to share this and hear from you.
Thank you. No, I absolutely agree, Raffaella, and some standard drugs I think are a major problem, and they're probably for anti-infectives much more important than falsified medicines for engendering drug resistance that is becoming increasingly on the global radar, and that's, I think, an additional weapon that we can use to argue for their elimination. But if you've alluded to, it needs a strong medicine regulatory authority to police and to regulate manufacturers so that the medicines that they produce are of good quality. If they don't, then I think they should be closed down. And if they're closed down and they still manufacture, then depending on the definition, they would probably be then regarded as manufacturing falsified medicines, and therefore they would be clearly, in many countries, breaking criminal law. But even if a company, despite many warnings, does not improve production, and people suffer as a result, if people die as a result, then in some countries corporate manslaughter is an offence, and so perhaps corporate manslaughter charges could be brought against such a company. I'm not aware of that having happened, but that would be one way of trying to ensure that the medicines that we take from genuine manufacturers are universally of good quality.
I fully agree with what Paul just said, and it is something against which we're confronted. Repetitively, people in the field tell us, yes, but what about different production lines? They call it different production lines. It's very difficult to prove that a medicine that is substandard has been substandard coming out from the factory, and that it was an intent on the part of the factory to make it substandard. Substandard basically means that the product was not manufactured to the standards of production which have been agreed and approved. Nonetheless, there are two elements. One is that the global database that the WHO is building allows also to build a body of evidence on this kind of problem. We ask people to report to us both substandard, severely substandard, not minor quality defect errors that have been notified by the manufacturer themselves. Like, for example, a vial has broken along the supply chain and there might be glass in other productions. So that happens every day, everywhere, and it's really non-intentional. So either severely substandard products or falsified products. The case of in Pakistan, that is a substandard product. It's definitely a substandard product, because what happened is, along the manufacturing process of the dextromethorphan, something went wrong and there was a significant amount of levomethorphan. However, we were able to prove that there was a criminal intent along the distribution chain, because certificates of analysis of the active ingredient, so the primary material, had been falsified. Basically, they claimed to have completed certificates of analysis and that the analysis was okay, whereas they hadn't, because the analysis of this particular product required optical rotation, and the optical rotation did not comply. So in this particular case, we were able to prove the criminal intent along the lines of falsified certificates of analysis. So that's one thing. Another thing is, as I was just saying, building a body of evidence. If continually you have, from a certain number of countries, along a certain number of orders made, the analysis of received products which are substandard, then you can start and guide people and along the lines of what Paul was saying. And finally, there's just another example I would like to share with you. A couple of years ago, we had a report come from Central Africa and on products that were being manufactured in Europe, in an EU country, and we alerted the authorities of that relevant country, and when they investigated, they realized that that factory, that company, were manufacturing products against malaria, which contained only 80% of the active ingredient, and analysis of all the paperwork showed that the factory knew very well that they were only putting 80% of the active pharmaceutical ingredient in those products, and then they were also exporting the products even though they had no authorization whatsoever to export those products. So they were because legislation is slow and bureaucratic times are slow, the tribunal for that is still also ongoing. And some would argue, and I can hear the case, that would count as a falsified medicine because it did not contain the label claim. It says on the box that it should contain 100% of the active ingredient, and it only contained 80%. But yes, you have different examples of substandard or quote-unquote intentional substandard medical products, but it is very difficult to prove, and most of the time, like for falsified medicines, you do it on a different basis, the legislation.
Okay. So, there's still one question, and then I draw the line because we have some coffee break. But please go ahead.
But isn't it really a problem that the authority that's looking into the phenomenon and wants to stop the production of these spurious drugs is also spending a lot of time trying to identify intent, which is a legal and moral issue, and it will take a lot of man-hours to do that part. If you instead if one authority such as WHO would focus on then leave the other issue to somebody else. That would seem more rational.
I'm not sure I understand. You're asking WHO to identify the mens rea? The criminal intent?
I think that trying to identify not only whether something has been falsified, but also if there was a criminal intent underlying that falsification is an unnecessary effort for WHO. That's
we don't.
Other authorities that are more suited for that.
We don't do any law enforcement investigation as police investigations because WHO is absolutely not a criminal justice system. It's just that in the investigation that we do to protect public health, we come across certain pieces of information that are then useful for the other parts of the law enforcement investigation. We don't do the mens rea or we don't do all of that.